primarily used with 8th grade students enrolled in a supplemental creative writing course at a performing arts middle school in Goose Creek, South Carolina. But many of these texts would be suitable for high school students and undergraduates as well. Several of these narratives, including 2 short stories from What We Fed to the Manticore by Talia Lakshmi Kalluri, warrant further discussion. Kalluri's collection includes stories written exclusively from animal perspectives, including its titular short story, which gives voice to tigers living amidst the mangrove trees in Bangladesh. In the short story, climate change takes on the monstrous form of a creature from legend, the manticore, which devours both civilization and the natural world alike in its all-consuming hunger. The narrative not only calls attention to the rising waters that threaten Bengal tigers in India and Bangladesh, it also illustrates how human behavior exacerbates those threats. Likewise, Someone Must Watch Over the Dead features a young vulture who narrates a religious moment when over 200,000 saga, an antelope, the antelope with the funky nose there, it's a weird-looking antelope, but they dropped dead in the hundreds of thousands due to rising temperatures. So in addition to these narrative engagements with real-world climate issues, Kalluri's collection includes an appendix of nonfiction sources for each of the narratives. And these nonfiction connections not only serve as an excellent resource for unit planning for pre-service teachers preparing thematic text sets, but they can also serve in conversation as mentor texts to illustrate how Kalluri uses narrative form to grapple with real-world environmental questions. In the stories featured in What We Fed to the Manticore, Kalluri endeavors to center the experiences of more-than-human protagonists. However, it is also possible to attune to more-than-human elements in anthropocentric stories. Consider the more-than-human possibilities in various canonical texts, like Lord of the Flies. Instead of simply noting the symbolism of the conch in isolation, students might be asked to consider how the boy's colonial mindset quickly disrupts the delicate ecosystem on the island, leading to its fiery destruction in the final passages of the novel. What might it look like to shift our gaze to the unsettled landscape in Macbeth, to the heaving waters and their eyes were watching God? There are many such opportunities to learn with the more than human throughout commonly taught novels in the K-12 English curriculum. Furthermore, there are tools we can incorporate into their writing pedagogies to support students in crafting more than human narratives. First, it's important to recognize that many more than human narratives are nonlinear. Consider the ebb and flow of the tides and the rise and fall of the moon. In addition to these cyclical narratives, there are other natural phenomena that are seemingly random. Think about the spontaneity of genetic mutations and the abrupt shift of tectonic plates ahead of an earthquake. Moreover, multi-species narratives like that of the nematode and the pine sawyer beetle are ill-suited to the linear plot diagrams found in most literature workbooks. The Common Core standards, which are currently adopted in 41 states, notably not Louisiana, include narrative writing in their standards for English language arts. The writing standards require students to be able to craft narratives which first engage and orient the reader by setting out a problem, before subsequently providing a conclusion that follows from and reflects on what is experienced, observed, or resolved over the course of the narrative. The Common Core standards, as currently written, might be said to reflect an Aristotelian framework for plot as described in his Poetics. Now, a whole is that which is a beginning, a middle, and an end. In the early 1860s, you have Gustav Freytag, who expands on Aristotelian notions of plot, adding rising action. And again, we have a problem. Let me present again. There we go. The cursor keeps disappearing, which makes it very difficult to scroll down the speaker notes, which is a challenge. So over a century later, Freytag's pyramid, here we go, back up a little bit. In the early 1860s, Gustav Freytag expands on Aristotelian notions of plot, adding rising action and falling action onto the plot diagram in his techniques of drama. Over a century later, Freytag's pyramid is nearly ubiquitous in English language arts classrooms, crystallized into practice through worksheets like the one pictured above from Read, Write, Think, a literacy resource database maintained by the National Council of Teachers of English. For many K-12 students, Gustav Freytag and his plot diagrams serve as their earliest encounter with narratology, even if the nuances of narratological study remain unfamiliar to them. Developed by structuralists in the 1960s, the field of narratology purports to study the science of narrative structure and form. Vivisecting narrative with the precision of a surgeon, adherents of structural narratology have created narrative lexicons akin to taxonomies for narrative form, offering an almost scientific system in which to study story structure across narratives. Though divorced from these theoretical underpinnings, introductory narratological frameworks have filtered down into the K-12 classroom. Beginning in the first grade, many students in English language arts classrooms are introduced to the most rudimentary of narratological principles. All good storylines consist of a beginning, a middle, and an end. But what happens when environmental narratives refuse these tidy structures? The dawn of the Anthropocene may force literacy educators to grapple with this question sooner rather than later. And so, from here, we turn to indigenous futurisms. So, White offers the example of the Anishinaabe, whose spiraling understanding of time generates narratives of cyclicality, reversal, dreamlike scenarios, counterfactuality, irregular rhythms, ironic uncyclicality, slipstream parodies of linear pragmatism, and eternality, among others. In other words, indigenous narratives can offer us generative models for composing the more than human world. And so, in addition to learning from indigenous narratives, including those rooted in indigenous futurisms, students might generate their own speculative narratives. In my own middle school classroom, as well as my grad student classroom now, we have included writing assignments hosted on Twine, an open source interactive storytelling platform that allows students to create both branching narratives and cyclical narratives. Twine enables students to craft non-linear narratives capable of projecting different possible climate futures based on their imagined environmental choices. Moreover, the platform enables students to craft narratives that mirror the ebb and flow of the tides. Through a series of simple coding commands, students can generate cyclical narratives that continue without end, rippling outwards like the rings found in a tree stump. Although the platform requires some rudimentary HTML knowledge, my students were soon lost in constructing non-linear narratives, their fingers flying across the keyboards. In fact, it was hard to get them to do anything else at the end of the unit. So beyond actively engaging students, Twine brought them one step closer to crafting story worlds capable of accounting for the rich, multi-species world around them. And so I'm going to show some examples from these units here in just a moment. But first is an example that I showed students right at the beginning of thinking about narrative in cycles. And this is just a narrative cycle of the seasons. And so you have fall, winter, spring, and summer in this ever-looping cycle. But here we have, I think, one that is very 8th grade, typos included. So last year, my 8th grade creative writing students created non-linear narratives for their summative assessment during our unit on speculative fiction. Twine gave students the opportunity to imagine narratives that exceeded the plot diagrams of their literature textbooks, imagining these more than human multi-species worlds. Students were eager to share their completed narratives at the end of the unit. Students projected their non-linear narratives on the board at the front of the room, inviting their classmates to explore the worlds they had created. One student created a branching narrative following a cockroach as it attempted to escape an exterminator in a cluttered kitchen. And that is what you are looking at here, the cockroach escaping the exterminator in the kitchen. And I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. Another student wrote from the perspective of a fox foraging for her young following an ecological disaster. Yet another student created a narrative that looped back to the beginning again and again until the reader finally figured out how to break out of the narrative cycle using coding commands that hid keys and clues inside their narrative. Now, not every student writer leaned into the more than human themes from our reading. Nevertheless, they were empowered with tools to narrate phenomena from the natural world that might otherwise exceed capture on the page. Now, once they've mapped out their story worlds, it becomes a choose-your-own-adventure kind of narrative. And I'll escape here for just a moment and show you a little bit about what that looks like. So over here, you should be able to see, this is like the landing page for Twine. Twine is absolutely free. It is browser-based, meaning if your student in your middle school setting has a loaner laptop, they cannot access their Twine unless it has been saved in a Google Cloud. So we would always have students save them, back them up, because if for whatever reason their Chromebook went down, their Twine went down too, which was disastrous when it did happen, and it did happen. And so from here you can see, you can click on it. This is, again, the student example of escaping the exterminator, and you can see the story map. So they're able to see the branching narrative. They're able to see, I'm going to go back here again, the pine tree going in these different directions. Some of my other ones are saved in the cloud in various spaces. But from here, if I want to launch the story, I go test from here, and I can also publish from here. It creates the choose your own adventure. And so, if you'll indulge me, let's choose our own adventure. We are the roach in the kitchen. I'm going to call for some audience participation here so you can see what it looks like and how it works, and then I'm going to contextualize it. So, one night you smell something delicious and sweet coming from a home. There are no lights on, which makes it safe to investigate and find out what this scent is. You come across a sugar cookie. What are we going to do? Are we going to nibble on our sugar cookie crumbs, or are we going to keep exploring for yummier food?
You're obviously nibbling.
Yeah.
We're nibbling on the cookie? Okay, wow, instant gratification all the way. Okay, let's go for it.
Right now.
All right, your stomach rumbles. You begin to regret eating those stale cookie crumbles. Suddenly, you feel a sharp pain in your stomach. Do you, again, complete with 8th grade typos, like you are getting authentic here, okay? So do you scurry to find a place to do your business, or do you hold it in for the time being and thug it out? Again, it is 8th graders, here we are.
Thug it out.
Thug it out.
Okay. So you decide to try to thug it out. After some time, your stomach rumbles. Something is very, very wrong. Then you hear footsteps coming. You toughen up and push through it. You got this. Or you attempt to befriend the human and ask for help.
Yeah, do that.
Okay?
Always a good idea.
You crawl toward the human. You're just a little bug after all. And you scurry towards it and make a little grunt to signal for help. The person screams and gets ready to run, but then realizes you mean no harm. It kneels down and gives you some food. It was just a little stomach ache. You were just hungry. The person smiles and lets you back outside. You survived. So yay, we survived. And so from here, like if she wanted to, she could have like looped back to the beginning, start over. She did that. I don't think she did that for any of like the you died scenarios, but there are ways to loop back and make it work so that you can try again and again and again. And so from there, you could develop much more sophisticated stories. And indeed, like there were some story maps where I was like, you spent hours in date, like did you sleep? Because their maps were so expansive in all of these different directions. And the way that you create, just to give you like a little bit of a brief insight, is you create location cards with very, very simple commands with these brackets like this, double bracket, and I'm going to add a destination. Let's do find food. If we wanted to start over, and you will see now that it loops back up to find food. And you could create the story again, and then you could also go in and hide that destination. So if you wanted to say something else, you might write over here, start over. And so now, whenever they click on it, it says start over, but it takes you back to the destination. Now, that was like the minimum of like what I taught students how to code. You had some students, or I had some students who went and they found all of these Twine message boards and things like that, and they were coding health bars, images, boss battles. It was insane. I did not spend that time in my classroom on that. I was more interested in like the different ways of forming narrative, but there were kids who bought in further when they wanted to buy in a little bit further. So back over here, come back, present.
I want to do my faculty evaluation that way.
Choose your own adventures, yeah. And so some of the things that we talked about were, you know, how some stories do benefit from a cyclical nature. Some students do loop off in different directions, but then maybe could go back to like a center point. But we were looking at all of these narrative forms. One of the things that we also used in this particular unit, in addition to like science fiction and more than human text, were things like video games. And we would look at mapping out video games and like various like linear story worlds versus branching story worlds versus open world story worlds, and thinking about like what we can learn about storytelling from these forms that have already allowed us to do these different things that like it's a lot harder to do and print and paper. But there are writers who are doing this kind of work. There is a collection of poetry about Emmett Till. The name is escaping me right now. If you know it, let me know. But it is poetry that is written as almost like a choose-your-own-adventure story. And the poems take you through this experiential engagement with Emmett Till. So there are people doing this sort of work in like literary spaces, not just in pop culture spaces as well. But I think what it does is I think it helps us map on some of these environmental ideas into a place that is like visual for students to be able to actually see what these narratives look like beyond simply the plot diagram. And so, revisiting our bookshelves. So many of our students have long since abandoned their childhood bookshelves, but our childhood stories may continue to offer us wisdom that transcends the simple morals contained within their pages of things like Aesop's fables, etc. So in this talk, I've attempted to illustrate the importance of developing teaching practices that center more than human narratives at a moment when we need these narratives the most. In doing so, I've endeavored to illustrate how many of these pedagogical practices are rooted in indigenous wisdoms and indigenous ways of knowing the world that significantly predate a lot of post-human scholarship and significantly predate the present environmental climate crisis, but also invite us to attune to the more than human world around us in the present. Many state standards are also written with the expectation of progress. Students are expected to move through reading levels, leaving behind deceptively simple animal narratives found in childhood in order to attend to anthropocentric narratives which are seen as more complex and more relevant. But we lose our talking flora and fauna somewhere along the way. Hawker 2020 reminds us that these expectations of progress have the dangerous potential of obscuring the truth, which is that the talking animals have never left us, we have merely forgotten how to listen. Thank you, and I have time for questions. Yes?
This is fabulous. I think it sparks so many different thoughts. Like one is, I'm reminded of teaching high school English and how much I struggled with that plot. Pyramid, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I was like, well, this could be the climax, but maybe this could be the, you know. And
Or it's like jagged
Yeah.
peaks of climax,
and then
but
sometimes
like, yeah.
there's like short stories often don't have like a resolution, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I just always struggled with like, I felt like I was supposed to be able to find it all. And I felt like I was just being boxed in. I also, you show the Ray Bradbury book cover, and I was thinking of it not more than a human story of his, but a sort of post-human in a really simple sense story of his called There Will Come Soft Rains.
And that was the text. So the Martian Chronicles is a fix-up narrative, and that it contains several of his other short stories that have been linked together with brief narrative interludes to make them connect. And There Will Come Soft Rains is one of those books that was originally published in Collier magazine, but has been incorporated into this space.
Okay. Nuclear disaster.
Oh, for sure. And then
all
the house.
People die, but the house, the machines keep going, right? The technology keeps going. I guess, so my main question is about this phrase, the more than human,
Yes.
right? And I wonder, like, if you can define that and where that comes from. And if there's, I guess I wonder in some ways if a phrase like the more than human is still centering the human.
It is.
Yeah.
It is, and I think that's quite intentional. So a lot of people have adopted the term more than human. I'm mainly thinking about more than human in the tradition of Donna Haraway. But for me, the more than human is about relationships and entanglement. And so for me, the more than human are these moments of encounter between the human and the more than human world, and thinking about what's exchanged in those moments of encounter. And one of the things that I want to think about when I think about post-humanisms, so post-humanisms I think really ought to be plural, because you have so many different theoretical schools that inform post-humanism, and many of them are like pretty fundamentally opposed to each other theoretically. Like the anti-humanist and the transhumanist are both lumped under post-humanism, but they're really approaching a lot of present-day problems from really different positions and really different ways of thinking about the role of the human in this. And so for me, the way I conceptualize it is the post-human and the more than human for me is thinking about the human in relation with the other world, not erasing the human, but thinking about us as a part of nature rather than a part from nature, and breaking down a nature-culture divide to think about how we're already embedded in the natural world. Yes?
I love the double entendre of that phrase, coming from the two meanings of more, where more can mean added to, and more can also mean greater than. So there's a kind of a sort of a moral to that lesson as well. So I appreciated that. I wanted to ask you about the connection to Freire's work with his catchphrase, reading the word to transitioning to reading the world. For Freire, the world that he wanted his students to read was the political and social world.
Absolutely.
For you, it's the ecological world. And the political social world makes the act of reading itself political. And I'm wondering if you are oriented in some way. I know that there's a kind of a political motive behind wanting people to be more engaged with the ecological world and their thinking and their structures of narrative, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a kind of a political backdrop to that, given the political crisis around ecology. But I'm wondering if you see, along with Freire, reading the word as being, reading the world through reading the word as being also inherently political rather than political in a kind of a background way.
Yeah, well, I think environmental issues are inherently also social and cultural issues as well. So I'm thinking specifically about reading the Anthropocene and reading all of the literature around the Anthropocene. You will often find people centering this we, but who is the we of the Anthropocene, right? Like in universalizing humanity, we are really ignoring the fact that the producers of pollution, etc., are often not the ones dealing with the immediate fallout of that pollution. And so it is an issue of equity as well. I'm thinking about specifically Gabriel Hecht's work, looking at the uneven distribution of like climate crisis impact in South Africa, and looking at the global south and thinking about who is producing the pollution and who is being faced with the cleanup. It reinforces these political, historical, cultural issues that have been exacerbated over time through things like transatlantic slavery, through things like industrialization. I'm also thinking about concepts like slow violence, where it's not only like deferred in space, it's also deferred in time as well, where like we're thinking about climate issues that we are creating today that don't necessarily impact us here in the present, but impact future generations. And one of the other things that your comment brings up is thinking about how like even looking at where pollution centers are located. They're often located adjacent to minoritized communities. And so I think it is an inherently political issue. I haven't gotten into that with like my high school students, perhaps I should, but I have gotten into those conversations with my graduate students when we're looking at what does this look like in the global south. So the global south Anthropocenes, what does indigenous Anthropocenes look like? What do black diasporic Anthropocenes look like? And looking at the various work scholars have been doing to unsettle this like universal we. And I think that's the connection with Freire, that it is inherently, it ought to be an inherently political movement that is framed in equity. I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah. Yes, Chris.
So I just love your work so much, and this presentation was so exciting in so many ways. And I just found myself wondering, I mean, like you've given us some ways to help students think about narrative in much more sort of expansive terms that actually start to look a little bit more like the world we actually inhabit. I'm wondering, have you experimented in the classroom with sort of forms that are less sort of generically invested in the project of narrative as sequence of events, and maybe have a different relationship to the idea of narrative? I'm thinking about like lyric poetry or descriptive work or topography or any of these genres.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the work that I've done with students in like the middle school and the high school classroom has been arts-based. So not only thinking about like semantic meaning, but also thinking about like semiotic meaning and affect and emotion. And so for a lot of the projects that I would do with students at the middle school level is like there would be some sort of like standards-based part of it, because you had to have some kind of standards-based rationale or your administrator was going to knock on the door and like throw you out of the building. But like having some sort of component that allowed for different ways of making meaning. And I think that that's really important too, because so last night we just finished reading with my graduate student Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation. And we were looking, has anybody not read Annihilation? Okay, so there is a very, it's a very weird book. We were looking at weird narratologies and weird realisms. And there's this point where there's this crawler, this creature, this unknowable cosmic being, perhaps. It's definitely a more than human being, but it's writing words on a wall. And the words are these like pseudo-biblical revelation kind of words, but the words are ultimately meaningless. Like you would drive yourself mad trying to find the meaning of these words. But there's another layer to these words, and that these words are written in these like fungi spores, that when the biologist like gets too close to them, the spores release, she inhales them, and she is transformed, or like subsequently transformed over the course of the story. And one of the things that my graduate students and I were talking about were like the layers of this, right? Like she's infected by the words, like the words begin to appear, words as a virus, but also like the physical world. And we were looking at various layers of where do words begin to fail us, and like where do we need to turn to other ways of embodied storytelling. So it's definitely something that I want to lean more into, just prompted by a lot of the discussions from the students. But the other work that I'm also thinking about that I've done with grad students again is An Archive by Alexis M. Gumbs. She is a Black feminist writer, and she is imagining a speculative archive of the future post-climate crisis that applies Black feminist theory into imagining more than human bodies that have survived the apocalypse. And it's all done in like this experimental poetry. And so like we've engaged with like thinking about poetic responses to like theoretical work and thinking about like what meaning can we create there that exceeds what we're able to do in like theoretical jargon.
I just wanted to say I thoroughly enjoyed it. It made me think about, as a grad student, it was so hard to decide which hat I wanted to listen and glean from. Because first, as a grad student, I started looking at the anthropocentry of it when we were studying, where I'm actually reading Latterman's book, The History of Research, and I'm trying to see what theoretical perspective I want to take with my dissertation. So that really opened up some eyes, and looking at what she's saying in her book on how it affects teacher professional development and just education from that perspective. Then as I'm thinking about that and qualitative research, then I started, when you started with the narrative of the human narratives and being more human literacy in there, I'm thinking, I work with gifted and talented students and teachers. So I'm now thinking about my gifted ELA teachers on exposing them to this, on how to really differentiate the classroom and with our gifted learners, because some classes are a mixture of gifted and non-gifted, and we always try to show why we need to, you know, have a differentiated, not only project, but process. So the twine started, you know, picking my interest.
Like some kids stayed, again, some kids, I'm not gonna lie, they stayed very surface level, they did what they needed to do to pass the assignment, but you always have those kids, and like some kids just,
they're going to dig in, and because they are, simply because of the characteristics of our gifted learners, are non-linear, and that's okay. And I'm just thinking, oh my goodness, now I don't know how to listen. As you know, my theoretical perspective on this, or to help someone else with our learners, but it was very awesome. And I definitely will be reaching out to you on more than one level, because I love what you did, not only like you with the narrative and then the descriptors, and I'm just thinking, oh my goodness, because we always have parents that say, okay, they were doing this, but it's just not challenging enough, and what could you do, you know, what's separating, because we are in Louisiana non-Common Core, what are we doing in the gifted classroom that's different than the non-gifted classroom with our kids? And so I'm just like, oh my goodness, I don't know how to listen to this. I don't know which hat, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a treat, you were right.
yeah, so I think for me, like my theoretical thinking was born out of like frustrations that came in the classroom, where like again, like Sue was talking about, there would be moments where, you know, they were required to do this kind of story mapping that didn't fit the story. And so then very early in my graduate school experience, we were reading James G's work. James G? I've never actually said it out loud. You always have those, but talking about how like not every culture tells stories in the same way. And so I'm thinking specifically about, like, you have a lot of cyclical narratives and indigenous narratives. You have call and response in other cultural traditions, right? So how can we create space not only to like play with narrative form, which I love to do. I'm like a writer in my like spare time. I don't have anything like other than academic stuff published, but I love writing, and I love thinking about these problems. And so like beyond that, it's also again like an equity issue as well. The other thing that I was thinking about is in response to a lot of like the popular fiction that I read. And so has anybody read Lost Children's Archive by Valeria Luiselli? So good. It is so good. So to contextualize why this is important. So Valeria Luiselli is a journalist, and she does audio journalism, and she has a piece about the southern border and lost children at the southern border that initially starts out as this journalistic piece. And that journalistic piece is in conversation with Lost Children Archive that is structured in a couple of different really experimental ways. Like you have the archive box of archival materials that she's gathered doing her research, but then she also does these intertwining narratives that like what's real, what's speculative, it becomes hard to tell, and I don't want to spoil it. But there's a scene in it where the mother, because none of the characters in the book have names, they're like in Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation, like you have the biologist, the surveyor. Here we have the mother and the daughter, the son and the husband, and the mother is helping the daughter with homework, and the homework is these 4 boxes, and the boxes are like character, setting, problem, solution. And the daughter is like, good stories fit in these boxes. And I'm like, but no, they don't. And the mother is grappling with this as well. And I think about how story can help us really begin to narrate a world that is increasingly complex and weird if we give students the tools to do that. There's still a little bit more time if anybody has any other questions. Yeah?
Dr. Wittchow, what do you think about AI in when students, when you talk about creating stories, and do you think it's a tool, or is it something that is going to take away the human aspect to the non, or the more than human?
I mean, I think there are a lot of post-humanists who embrace AI. I don't think I'm one of them, because, so for me, the AI is like the crawler in, no, it's like the crawler in Annihilation. Let me explain. Okay, so in Area X, in this text of Annihilation, you have the more than human world there. That landscape is very much a character. The idea is that not only are we changing the environment is changing us. Like that is probably like the thesis of that book. But there is a space in that book where all of the journals of previous explorers are there. And they're composting, like